Hello again. Welcome back for our third lecture of this series on Maritime Buddhism. The spread of the Buddhist movement throughout the Indian Peninsula and across to Sri Lanka was impressive. The teachings of a single charismatic leader were, in a relatively short space of time, found throughout a cultural sphere. However, a far greater challenge awaited the tradition outside the cultural and linguistic domains of India. The Great Circle would carry Buddhist ideas and practices thousands of miles away from India. New homes for it were found along the coasts and rivers, and it was merchants who provided the elements necessary for this to occur. Eventually, the arcs of the Great Circle of Buddhism would encompass the whole of Southeast Eurasia. One portion of the arc went up from the west coast of India, up the Indus Valley, around the far end of the Himalayas, to the Tarim Basin, leading to Chang'an, Xi'an, a route of more than 4,000 miles. The connecting maritime segment of the Great Circle started on the western shores of India, circling around the peninsula and Sri Lanka, up the east coast of the Bay of Bengal, and then moving east along the coastlines of Bangladesh, Myanmar, Malay Peninsula, across to Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, before turning north to East Asia and the ports of China, Korea, and Japan. The circumference of both arcs measured enough miles to encircle the equator of the Earth. The indented shorelines contain 20,000 miles of surface, 5 times the land route mileage. Today, the equivalent of the Great Circle is often shown with the notation, more people live inside this circle than outside. At present, the population density of the Great Circle, including China and India, outnumbers all of the rest of the Earth's people. During the time of the spread of Buddhism around these arcs, starting in the 4th century BCE, this portion of Eurasia was even then a major populated area of the Earth. It was a market of sufficient size and diversity to attract attention of merchants from far distant ports. The population and the resources available within the Great Circle meant sizable wealth potential for traders who were willing to travel long distances and be away from their homes for months and years. Commerce along the southern coast of Eurasia grew rapidly during the time of the Roman and the Han empires. Wealth was being accumulated in an unparalleled pace through profitable exchanges of spices, silk, cotton, metals, and a host of natural products and manufactured objects. As this new commercial expansion was taking place, Buddhism stood ready to move with the merchants on both land and sea routes. They had, after all, been prepared for this moment in history by their founder and the way he interacted with merchants. Their movement had arisen in the Ganges basin with strong ties to the business community who carried on exchange between urban centers that could be several hundred miles apart. While international trade on a grand scale becoming a reality, goods, people, and technology flowed between the Mediterranean and East Asia, passing through the Indian cultural and social sphere of influence. It is often the case that the Buddhist involvement with merchants is seen as a passive act of following in the train of traders without having an impact on the way in which this trade developed. When we say that Buddhism was prepared to interact with the international merchants, it implies that the Buddhists also contributed to and helped expand the commercial system. The establishment of Buddhist monasteries with resident monks in far-flung spaces provided one form of cultural development that helped to sustain the network of support for the mercantile group. We have no way of knowing how many Buddhist monastics and lay pilgrims used the sea for travel over the last 2 millennia. Presence of Buddhist artifacts uncovered along the shorelines of South, Southeast, and East Asia indicates that thousands of individuals have been involved in these sites. The written records of names and activities of travelers is a relatively short list. And this lack of information helps to account for the neglect of the study of Maritime Buddhism. However, once we expand our search beyond the text and include such things as archaeology, art, commercial records, mapping, inventory of artifacts, shipwrecks, the study of art and architectural features, a picture emerges of the previously undocumented past. The spread of Buddhism is truly shown to be a massive expansion of cultural features and practices as the religion moved off the shores of South Asia. Now, the expansion of Buddhism outside of India can be tracked through the archaeological record. First, to Sri Lanka. At the same time, there are many received stories that give a narrative account of how Buddha's teachings were taken by sea to Sri Lanka. For example, it's said that the Buddha's only child, Rahula, was sent there as a monk to spread the message of his father. Movement from the southeast coast to Sri Lanka meant that Buddhist teachers had to take ships and sail between ports. While it was a relatively short distance, the implications of the journey were significant. The teachings of the Buddha need not be limited to Indians or to the Ganges basin. They could be taken to a distant shore and be given to a different ethnic group. The stage was set for making full use of mercantile and merchant travels to introduce the Dharma in very different environments, making use of a variety of languages and dialects for oral teaching. Buddhism left the peninsula through the existing system of shipping with sailing ships. The ports that existed for this enterprise lined the coastline of India, forming an interlocking system of local trading circuits. It was along the route between these ports that travelers and monks and trade moved on the Indian rim of the Great Circle of Buddhism. Now, when the monks began to go with traders across the seas, Buddhist monasteries and communities along the coast had to be ready to join in the venture. In searching for the nature of Buddhism in relationship to location by the sea, it's been necessary to determine a method of mapping the ancient sites. Well, with the help of the Archaeological Survey of India, the Atlas of Maritime Buddhism project started this data collection by mapping all the known Buddhist archaeological sites, localities in Tamil Nadu and Kerala state of South India. Using GPS tools to accurately note the location of these sites, the teams collected data that clearly demonstrated the clustering of Buddhist artifacts along the coast. Some sites line the banks of rivers that lead from the hinterlands to the seaports. But these riverine sites are spread far apart by some distance, and their numbers are smaller and less dense than the ones found in the port regions. In other words, Buddhist communities and centers were well placed to participate in maritime activity. Now, leading away from the rivers, sites were also found along the land routes where animals and humans were needed to transport goods. Their numbers are small compared to the ports and the riverine ones. It appears that the further one is from the harbors and navigable rivers, the fewer the archaeological remains of Buddhism. Now, the georegistration of Buddhist material clearly indicates that in South India, Buddhism was a coastal-based movement. It was the case that population density in general was focused along the coast. And it should not come as a surprise that Buddhist sites were found in these areas. Well, there is now proof to say that a large number of the major Buddhist places are located on the rim of the Great Circle, especially where it is defined by the seashore. We find such important centers as Nagarjunakonda, Amaravati, Palembang. At the seaside along those, based on the riverine patterns, we also find Pagan, Ayutthaya, Angkor Wat, and Guangzhou. This raises the issue of the process by which religion, ideas, art forms, cultural features move from place to place, sometimes over hundreds of miles. None of these features move unless transmitted by individuals. So who was there to make the journey over these long distances? Until very recent times, most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. The attempt to make a longer journey of many days or weeks, that was very complex. A traveler had to have geographic information about the territory beyond their experience. In addition, they would require supplies, medicine, even weapons, language, even when only dialects magnify with distance. Long journeys could face harsh conditions, especially from weather, temperature, animals, and hostility from strangers. Given all these barriers to travel, we can understand how crucial it was for Buddhist monks to join with those people who knew how to go from one place to another. The main group that was able to handle all of the issues of long-distance travel were merchants. They were the ones who made repeated journeys, usually on a circuit that operated between two market centers. In looking at Maritime Buddhism, we see a prime example of how religion was able to be transmitted dependent on the mercantile activity that could support long-term contacts between population centers. It should be noted that the role of the merchant was not just to transport the monks and leave them to their fate. Merchants, like the monks, sailed on vessels that were often manned by Arabs and others from the western reaches of Asia. When we refer to the monks being aided in their travel, it is to say that the merchants who arranged to transport goods from one center to another, continued to give support to the monks after arriving at a port city. A commitment to Buddhist monks was long-term, and this was crucial to the maintenance and eventual establishment of permanent sites through the seaports. Now, the teaching carried by the monks was not sufficient to drive the forces of such a transmission. Only when monks were able to move to a distant site and maintain their livelihood could religious practices and doctrines be made portable. The early spread beyond the shores of Sri Lanka and India was primarily male. Women had greater problems with such travel. It was not until the 19th century, when European women became explorers and moved about the world alone, that we find more than very limited female travel. As we will see later, the first Buddhist nuns from South Asia finally made it to China in the 6th century, and it was by sea. Now, the transmission of Buddhism was not just the migration of believers to new homes, nor was it only the conversion of individuals in these locations. The tradition was a complex structure of rituals based on lunar calendar, yearly and seasonal festivals, training for a priestly group to administer and lead such communities, a large and ever-expanding corpus of text that recorded an oral tradition that had been handed down over centuries and required periodic copying for preservation. Art and architecture, well, they required trained artisans to create and maintain religious structures and embellishments. Rules of conduct for monastics as well as laity required regular chanting as a reminder of how to act in relationship to one's personal life as well as living with others. And there was dress code for the members. It's only when the full structure of Buddhism had been established could the far-flung groups maintain a self-generating ability to survive without dependence on leadership coming from India. The cost of transferring such an intricate culture was great. But the merchants on the rim of the Great Circle had the means to give this level of support. The emergence of groups of followers raises the question of how they were recruited. Given the complex nature of having a fully functioning Buddhist organization, now in many cases, the merchants were the first Buddhists to be found in the ports and urban centers of trade. Since numerous merchants had dual residence, where months of each year were spent in both, it is probable that they had two families. Our example of this comes from the documentation of Islamic merchants in Indonesia and Malaysia. Coming from the Western Asian regions, or from Gujarat in northwest India, These traders arrived in Southeast Asian ports without families or wives. Today, DNA studies show that the genetic markers for Indonesian Islamic communities only show male ones from the West. The ancestors who came to trade married local women and established their families. That is why no matrilineal DNA shows up for their homelands. A similar pattern must have been true for early Buddhist traders. They would have established kinship ties to families of local wives. Children of such arrangements would have constituted part of the Buddhist membership in the port. Once trained teachers were brought to provide regular patterns of practice, they had to break out of the ghetto of foreign traders to find converts among the general population. In Xi'an, the attempt to convert Han ethnic persons was difficult, and it took several generations before they had local followers who trained as monks or nuns. It was helpful that the Buddhists who were encouraging locals to join were merchants who had resources and operated businesses. Some must have found it profitable to share religious life with wealthy foreigners. As the Buddhist community survived over decades, they eventually produced trained monks who were fully part of the local culture and spoke the language and dialects. From this perspective of population, the seaport routes connected to a much larger group of people than was the case of caravan routes in the mountains and the Tarim Basin. While the density and size of cities in both ends of the caravan route were significant, the areas through which travel moved overland was sparsely populated, and the flow of traders and those who served them dominated life. This was less so with the mercantile trade, which operated with links to ports that were occupied with both merchants as well as local groups who maintained social and cultural patterns over generations. The fact that when caravan routes were less used, the whole urban development in Inner Asia was abandoned. This is an indication that many of these populated towns were totally dependent on travelers and did not have sufficient numbers of local resources sufficient to sustain them. Seaports were different in setting and size. They were often at the mouth of rivers that connected them to a large number of farmers, artisans, and city dwellers. The hinterlands of the port had surpluses that were used to exchange with passing maritime merchants. The spread of Buddhism by land and ocean was one of the greatest transmissions of culture in the history of mankind. And the expansive trade networks and the wealth being created through these commercial exchanges was an essential part of the developments contained within the Great Circle of Buddhism. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope to see you next time.